and one of the co-organizers for this speech or this presentation that we're going to listen to this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Alfred Tovias, who is Professor Emeritus at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. He was also, or he continues to be, I believe, Jean Monnet's chair of the External Economic Relations at the same university. He's also, I think, almost a lifetime member, probably, of the board of directors of the FEMIS network, which is a network that was created by the EU in order to sort of organize and structure all the research done on economic relations in the Euro-Mediterranean partnership. He's also a former consultant to OECD, the World Bank, UNCTAD, and many other prestigious places. And also, on a personal note, it's a great pleasure to have him here today, because I consider Professor Tovias as one of the founding fathers of the study of Euro-Mediterranean relations. I remember way back in grad school when I was reading the mandatory readings, and Professor Tovias was always very prominent among those readings. And he's definitely a referent in terms of reading about Euro-Mediterranean economic relations. So it's a great privilege to have you here with us today, Professor Tovias.
Thank you. Sorry, the mic. Closer. Yeah, shall I put it here? Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It is a pleasure to always come back to my hometown, Barcelona, where I was born many years ago, and then I migrated to Israel, where I did all my academic career. And as you can imagine, I have always been interested by the Mediterranean because the two countries to which I am more sentimentally attached, Spain and Israel, are both Mediterranean countries, and also because I have from early on been interested in the phenomena of regional economic cooperation and integration. First related to this unique creature called the European Union, and then the links that the European Union, then called the European Economic Community, was establishing early on in the 1970s, both with Spain, even under Franco, and with Israel. These relations developed, as you know, leading to the entry of Spain into the European Union as a full member, and Spain becoming a very important actor in what relates to EU-Mediterranean relations for obvious reasons, and Israel being always very interested in having a privileged relationship with the European Union. Anyway, that's not the subject today, but the subject today is the Union for the Mediterranean in its first decade. And let me first start with an introduction and an overview of my lecture, and you will then understand why I have decided to start by the end and not by the beginning, in relating to you, in explaining to you what the Union for the Mediterranean is. Now, the various European Community and later on European Union initiatives, such as the Global Mediterranean Policy of 1972, the renovated Mediterranean Policy of 1990, the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership in the framework of the so-called Barcelona Process of 1995, and then the European Neighbourhood Policy of 2003. All these initiatives sought to make the Mediterranean region an area of peace, stability, and prosperity. All these initiatives were supposed to promote, on the one hand, the stabilization of the region, and then the promotion of trade among the countries participating in these initiatives. I must say, before I continue, that among those initiatives of the European Union that I mentioned over time, the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership of 1995, so-called Barcelona process, went slightly beyond trade in that it contained also a security basket supposed to facilitate political dialogue among the member partners of the partnership, and a civil society basket supposed to enhance cooperation among national NGOs, non-governmental organizations. But a consensus prevailed 10 years ago, let's say mid-2007, that the Barcelona process of 1995, the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, and the European Neighborhood Policy of 2003, both of these had not been a big success. In fact, some said, well, it's too soon to tell, but there are no palpable results, for example, of the European Neighborhood Policy of 2003. It was too soon to tell. In any case, in that year, the then new president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, thought it was high time to do some serious stock-taking, intimating openly that the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership and the European Neighborhood Policy were over-ambitious. It was better, he said, to concentrate simply in implementing large-scale transversal projects of interest to several Mediterranean riparian countries, and that's it. After a lot of serious EU infighting, the idea of setting up a Union for the Mediterranean emerged in the form of, as told by the French, a project's union for a union project. The Union would have its own institutions and decision-making procedures. In terms of contents, the Union for the Mediterranean overlaps mainly with the second basket of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, that is the economic one. But whereas the Barcelona process in its form of Mediterranean Partnership focuses on trade integration, namely the creation of bilateral free trade areas between the European Union and the different Mediterranean members of the EMP. The accent of the Union for the Mediterranean should be on trade facilitation rather than integration. That is, infrastructure projects and improvement of production factors, for example, educational and environmental projects. Until this very moment, the involvement of the civil society in the workings of the Union for the Mediterranean, a feature of the third basket, as I told you, of the Barcelona process of '95, seems minimal. The involvement of the civil society is not totally absent. I think that the most original idea in terms of methodology of the new creation, that is the UFM, and we will see that following, in what follows, is the labeling, the so-called labeling, whereby the smallish Union for the Mediterranean institutional infrastructures based here in Pedralbes, Barcelona, made out of experts of the 43 UFM member countries, study closely different projects, and eventually declare them as economically viable, something likely to induce potential public and private investors to come forward to finance the project. By early 2018, this year, more than 50 projects have been labeled. The UFM has really taken off when the EU convinced itself about 5 years, 6 years ago that the new organization, that is the UFM, was not competing with the ongoing EU policy initiatives that I mentioned before, the Barcelona process and the ENP, that is the European Neighborhood Policy, but rather it was a modest complement, which in fact was worthwhile to strongly support, even if, and that is the downside for the EU, the UFM is not part of the EU, properly speaking. Okay? That is an introduction and overview. Now, achievements by early 2018. Let me start this lecture for once, and exceptionally by the end, and explain you where the UFM is in early this year, 2018, practically a decade after it was established, namely on July 13, 2008. So this is an important date for those taking this course that you should know. And I do that is explaining you the achievements, for fear of being carried away in explaining to you the complicated history of the organization, which, as you see, and this is not mentioned by most of the people having written on this matter, as you see, had the very bad luck to be born just at the onset of the worst economic crisis of the world since the 1930s, the so-called Great Recession, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers taking place, note, 3 months after the UFM was created with all fanfare in Paris, July 2008, namely in September 2008. Obviously, conceiving an organization that is there to promote large-scale, risky investment in such conflicting area as the Mediterranean is, in the middle of a world recession, does not seem to be a very promising idea. Then, as you know, the so-called Arab Spring starting in late 2010, would inject for a while further uncertainty among the main players of whether or not to go forward, or if to wait until the Arab Spring would be over. So all these early years of the life of the new creature will be the object of my analysis in the second part of my lecture, if time allows. Otherwise, I will leave it for the question and answer part. So you will excuse me if for once I am not dwelling with the long history to which Elizabeth and myself were contributing a lot in writing and analyzing things in the early years of this decade, okay?
And very important contributions they were.
Yes, they were, yes. I have here a copy of Mediterranean Politics, which was a special issue devoted entirely to this matter around 2011, 2012, to which Elizabeth contributed. But this is over now. This is history. So let's go to 2019. And first, some facts. The Union for the Mediterranean, to begin with, is an intergovernmental organization, not a supranational organization, okay? made up by 43 member states, representing these member states about 800 million people. It's a lot, 800 million people, namely the 28 countries of the European Union and 15 other countries, mostly Mediterranean countries. In fact, they should be all Mediterranean countries, but you have two countries that, technically speaking, are not Mediterranean, like Mauritania and Jordan, which has no ports that touch the Mediterranean. Okay? I don't have time to go over the whole list, but I just mentioned that this includes Arab countries, but also Israel, Turkey, and countries of the Balkans that are candidates to enter eventually into the European Union, like Albania and Montenegro, etc., which are, of course, Mediterranean countries. The organization is based physically in a wing of the Palacio de Pedralbes in Barcelona, where about 65 public officials work, the prominent ones having a diplomatic status as well as an income offered by their countries. I will explain you later what this means. This executive, which is based in Pedralbes, in the form of a secretariat, is led by a Secretary General from the South. The Secretary General must be someone of the South, elected for a maximum of 6 years, and he is then seconded, according to the statutes, by 6 Deputy Secretary General, 3 from the South and East and 3 from the North. Each of them take up a portfolio, a subject, okay? The 60-plus person body in Pedralbes is financed, as far as current expenditure is concerned, 50% by the European Commission, while the rest is paid in by the 43 member states on a voluntary basis. I say voluntary basis because some member countries of the North, like the United Kingdom, are not contributing at all. Okay? I know for good that Israel is contributing. Many southern countries do not contribute, and most of these 50% that the European Commission does not pay is paid up individually by EU member states, different EU member states, France, etc. Okay? I want to mention in particular Sweden because it is a very generous country. It's your country. The SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, has allocated 2 years ago, if I'm not wrong, 6.5 million euro to support over 3 years the Union for the Mediterranean core activities. However, the UFM own budget excludes, and that's a big plus for the organization, excludes the wages of those public officials sent, the technical word used is seconded, okay? Sent by member states to work at the Union for the Mediterranean and which are paid directly by their governments, okay? So it's not like, say, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, where that has a budget and that pays its own public officials. Here, the most important public officials are paid by the governments and sent by the governments. Now, the Secretariat must report to the Council, which is made up of the member states and which is presided by 2 persons, 2 co-presidents, one from the north to be always the EU, represented by the relevant institutions. Normally, it is the High EU Representative and Vice President of the Commission, which is on top of the European External Action Service, currently Federica Mogherini, and the other co-president comes from the south and is voted by consensus, and now the position is held by Jordan. Now, it's very interesting because I heard that from a person that worked in the organization, that in fact, apparently, this person of the South that has the co-presidency cannot be, apparently, someone from Israel or someone from Turkey, nor from the Balkan states that I mentioned before. Only Arab countries could be the co-president. But this is something that is fuzzy. It is not decided for always. The Union for the Mediterranean has been organizing in recent times, since 2012, many ministerial meetings, even of ministers of foreign affairs, not a minor feat, if you think for a moment, given the charged international atmosphere and the conflicts between different Mediterranean riparian countries. Take Syria and Turkey, which are at odds. Okay? Until early 2018, as I said, I think before, the Union for the Mediterranean had labeled 50+ projects presented always by either international institutions, international development banks, such as the European Investment Bank or the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development based in London, and the member states, higher education and research institutions like universities, and some by civil society. Now, I think that it is very important, unfortunately, to mention here that the private sector is really underrepresented in those presenting projects, only 11%, which is a problem, if not a shame. Why? Because this was the wish of the founders, particularly former President Sarkozy. The idea was that by giving a level, the private sector would come forward. And I must say that even now that the world financial crisis is over, private investors pale by their absence. These labeled projects, according to the UFM, if implemented, would benefit more than 300,000 people and would require 5.3 billion euros to be invested. Sounds a lot. And projects are divided into different categories, such as higher education and research, water and environment, business development, energy and climate action, transport and development, and social and civil affairs. Some of these projects have been actually launched and partially implemented, about 15 or more by now. So take the numbers, 50+ projects labeled and 15 already running. I will dwell, in order not to be too fastidious with you, I will dwell with two examples I know relatively well, because Israel was heavily involved in both of them, both related to education and research. And the reason is that for the first 6 years, the Deputy Director General for Education and Research at the UFM was an Israeli, Professor Ilan Het, who I met several times. I thought also to devote time on these two examples I will mention, because they concern you as young people and students. Okay? On the one hand, there is the example of the so-called EMIS, the Eastern Mediterranean International School, created in Israel and which got the UFM label. It offers, for example, a 2-year international baccalaureate to 16 and 17-year-old students. Courses are delivered in English, while Arabic and Hebrew are taught as second languages. Now, here concretely, teaching started in academic year 2016-17. So this is the second year where the program is running. Now, to give you a flavor of how multinational the program is, only 28% of students are from Israel. There are many Arab students, there are Turkish students, and of course many European students that are benefiting from the program. According to what I read, by 2019, next year, the project will have benefited 600 students. Now, this is small fry if you think about the 800 million persons populating the 43 member states. I will mention then a much more important project, which is the so-called Euro-Mediterranean University of Fez in Morocco, funded by the government of Morocco, which has also gotten the UFM label. It started teaching at the MA level and in English, also in the academic year 2016 and 17. It is open both to students, academic and technical staff of all 43 member states. According to plans, by 2024, 6,600 students and 583 staff members are scheduled to be based in the new research institution. And I think that some of you might take an interest in what goes on if you are interested by Euromed matters. As you see, the approach of the Union for the Mediterranean is pragmatic. Of course, the Union for the Mediterranean discusses about and decides at the political level about projects presented to it that must have a regional dimension. So it is important to understand for you that the regional projects that are eventually approved are politically backed by the 43 member states, all by consensus. That is then supposed to send a strong signal, a strong message to whoever would like to join in implementing the project, for example, by investing money, by investing funds. Note that the 43 member states meet every 3 months at the ministerial level to decide on projects presented. So it's quite intensive. That per se gives or should give visibility to the projects retained. Not all the projects are accepted. Now, that is an overview of where we are now. I think at least when you come out, you have something to eat, okay? Now, a short analysis of the history of the idea, so history of thought, and then a short analysis of the history of the difficulties in setting up the new international organization. First, the history of the idea. In the spring 2007, President Sarkozy came out with the idea of creating, so he said, a Mediterranean Union. That was the name he gave, dealing with regional projects one by one. That would be a project approach, not at all dealing with politics, but with day-to-day needs of Mediterranean citizens. It would not be a top-down approach as compared with the Barcelona process, with the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, or with the European Neighborhood Policy. At the same time, he wanted that the concrete impact of the projects would be visible to all, particularly to civil society. For some, it reminded the Jean Monnet approach of the European coal and steel community. For others, the work of international economic organizations dealing with technical issues like the World Bank, okay? I am of the second school of thought because, contrary to what many people think, the Schuman-Monet approach was a political one, even if wrapped in a functionalist attire. Immediately, when Sarkozy came forward with this idea, big questions popped up in the minds of those following the news, among which Elizabeth and I were. But we are not the important ones. The important ones were the ones in the EU Commission in Brussels, and of course the government of Germany in Berlin. Everyone seemed to agree that Sarkozy's splash, because it was a real splash when he said that, came as a bombshell. Everybody agreed that it was timely, because the Mediterranean was being ostracized in international agendas by the emergence of China, India, and Brazil in the world scene, okay? So it was timely. To begin with, in Brussels, the big question was whether or not the 3 years old, the young, new for them, European neighborhood policy created in 2004 would be jeopardized by the new ideas of the French presidents. There were reasons to fear that to be the case, given comments made by some of the advisors of the French president. Now, 1 year later, the future, that is in 2008, 1 year later, the future of the European neighborhood policy in the south was not being questioned anymore, and countries like Morocco, willing to deepen their relations at the time with the EU much beyond what was contemplated by the Barcelona process, and the Union for the Mediterranean would be able to do so. There was another cloud that was lingering even after three chiefs of government, France, Spain, and Italy, met in December 2007, the so-called Appel de Rome, and which disappeared later on, this cloud, in 2008, namely the initial exclusion imagined by President Sarkozy of the Mediterranean Union idea of non-Mediterranean EU member states. So French representatives had been stating that only Mediterranean EU member states would be eligible, for example, to the European co-presidential seat at the proposed Council of the Union for the Mediterranean. This was rejected olympically in March 2008 by Germany, which, as a goodwill gesture to France, accepted that for the first 2 years, France would be co-presiding the Council. Another way to calm down the anxieties building up at the Commission in Brussels was to say that the Union for the Mediterranean was a kind of continuation of the Barcelona process, which is a European creature. But I think that this is not the case, because take note that membership of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, that is the Barcelona process of 1995, and on the other hand, membership of the Union for the Mediterranean do not coincide. The UFM, yes, does not include Libya, as the EMP does not include Libya, but it includes, as I told you before, Monaco, Bosnia, Albania, Montenegro, and Mauritania. So it is two different things. And then just mention to you that Syria suspended itself from participating in the Union for the Mediterranean in 2011. And I forgot to re-mention here that Mauritania, which for those who are studying European studies know that belong to the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific group of countries for the EU, now is considered in this UFM a Mediterranean country. Food for thought. Finally, another initial cloud slowly dissipated. During most of 2007, some experts in the South were suggesting that Arab heads of state or prime minister might not attend the July 2008 summit in Paris, which was giving birth to the Union for the Mediterranean, if the incumbent president of Israel at the time, Shimon Peres, or the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert would show up as well. It was also said that Libya would not become a member of the Mediterranean Union, which it didn't, should Israel become one. In fact, all these menaces proved more or less to be hollow. Everybody showed up in Paris, including President Assad. Another difference with the Barcelona process, the EMP, is that this time, and that for me is more important than whatever I have said before, there were no ambition of creating a Mediterranean sort of identity. As the new UFM to be created would be, as I said, termed Union for the Mediterranean, which literally speaking refers to efforts to be done by many actors, whether Mediterranean or not, for the benefit of Mediterranean countries. But there is no visible intention of changing the identity of those actors. As many observers have insisted since 2008, the UFM and its members do not have a common vision, since they do not share one, something that was present in, or apparently present, in the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership of 1995. This was stated once more in 2015 by Gabriel Busquets of the Spanish Foreign Ministry and one of the architects of the old Barcelona process in a summit conference organized by the Union for the Mediterranean in late 2015, which I attended. So I heard him say this: no common vision. A word now over the geo-economic dimension of the new international organization. You know, maybe, that South-South economic cooperation had by 2007 proved to be a pipe dream in the context of the Barcelona process and in the context of the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership. And even more so after the collapse of the Oslo process, which, for those who don't remember, was a process that should have led to the merging of two states, Israel and Palestine, after there was mutual recognition of Palestinians and Israelis under the Clinton presidency. So the question that arose was if the Union for the Mediterranean was not a distraction that would not lead to nowhere. We must take note that some Mediterranean countries are, until this very day, still interested preferably in pursuing the bilateral track favored by, for example, the European neighborhood policy, because it better takes into account of their idiosyncratic needs than the old Barcelona process and now the Union for the Mediterranean. So this is still a big cloud over the future of this organization. If the multilateral dimension of the Barcelona process was and is considered, as I say, by some Mediterranean countries as a sideshow, never mind that I think it is unjust to say that it is a sideshow, because one of its creation is, for example, the Anna Lindh Foundation, based in Alexandria, maybe some of you have heard about, and also Euromesco, based in this house, which some of you know it about its existence. But seen from far, it doesn't seem that this is much to be spoke about, home about. So how could one consider that the UFM project was more than what Barcelona had delivered? Moreover, let's not forget that trade policy is dealt with by Brussels. Immigration policies, increasingly so. Common agricultural policy, Brussels. Common competition policy, Brussels. All these things are decided in Brussels, not in Paris and not in Barcelona. This leaves practically only energy, education, and environmental issues for the UFM, which is not bad, per se. In terms of content for the Union, the idea of launching investment projects on a sub-regional basis seems to be a brilliant one, as it works discreetly in favor of peace and reconciliations. So these projects could, in theory, enormously promote trade between ancient belligerents, such as Israel and Egypt, or Morocco and Algeria. Jean Monnet would certainly have found as very positive. In that respect, a clear advantage of the Sarkozy approach, of the project approach, is that it is not ideological, but technocratic. Even more so than the EU association agreements signed with Mediterranean countries by the EU. In passing, it so happens that many of the projects studied by the UFM Secretariat in Pedralbes do not at all involve agents of civil society that sometimes have a clear political agenda, for example, artists, the media, Amnesty International, whatever. And this is quite a departure in relation to the Barcelona process, which was and is also multilateral in its nature, but which, in spite of its original intentions not to interfere, for example, with the Oslo process, treated there and here in murky waters to Israel's annoyance. Not the case in the UFM at all. Now, if I have time, you will tell me. I wanted to make a short history of the difficulties in setting up the new international organization, sometimes a shame. We must recall here briefly the chaotic operational start of the UFM, when after 6 months, the first Secretary General of the UFM, Mr. Massadeh from Jordan, resigned for both personal and professional reasons. Then a second Secretary General was named, Mr. Amrani from Morocco, which did not last much longer, but for the very honorable professional reason to be named minister in his government. So Morocco manifested its wish to keep for itself the job of Secretary General for the rest of the time left to Mr. Amrani, so quite fast he decided to send Dr. Sigil Massi, also a former ambassador of his country in France, and, very, very important for me, a PhD in economics. The new Secretary General reigned over the new organization with enthusiasm and efficiency until about 1 month ago, March 2018. There is currently, if you want to know, an acting Secretary General, and it seems that the new Secretary General will be a former Egyptian minister that will take, or Egyptian ambassador, that will take the new position next June. And as I said before, when speak about the organization, he is named for 3 years, but normally this is renewed once, and then it's over, okay? So the important feature here I want to mention is that the cycle of 6 years, the first cycle of 6 years for the Secretary General and the 6 Deputy Secretary Generals has taken place, which has given stability to the organization in terms of organization. So all those who entered in 2010 have finished their function, have been replaced now, and so it seems like routine has set in as far as organization is concerned. In fact, the important feature in terms of history is that since 2012, the Union for the Mediterranean is overwhelmingly a European-financed institution, and hence, in my opinion, should be dealt as a European international organization. As recognized by former Commissioner for Enlargement and Neighborhood Policy, Füle, the UFM was given a strong impetus as from 2012 when the EU took over the function of the Northern Co-Presidency of the UFM. As I said to you, France had to renounce to the co-presidency in favor of the EEAs, that is the External Action Service of the European Union, because so it was mandated by the Treaty of Lisbon that had to be implemented in 2012. France didn't like it. It made a lot of opposition, but in the end, Mrs. Ashton took over, and now Mrs. Mogherini is doing the job. Now, this leads me to a point that seems to me very important, the importance of co-ownership. It seems to be more valued nowadays than thought initially. As you know, the Union for the Mediterranean is based on the idea of co-ownership, a big departure from the, for example, European neighborhood policy philosophy, so much criticized for the lack of co-ownership. For example, this was one of the reasons Algeria had been very against being part of the European neighborhood policy, because everything was dictated from Brussels. Now, when the word co-ownership popped up, Israel was very much against, because it thought that it would lead to the politicization of the Union for the Mediterranean. Why? There was a tradition by Arab League countries, as you know, to use international organizations as an arena to vent its criticism of Israeli policies. And to cap it all, the Arab League, the Arab League was an observer of the Union for the Mediterranean bodies as decided upon in 2008 as part of a compromise. And fears at the beginning were confirmed in the period setting up the new organization, because all the time the Arab-Israeli conflict came up in the discussion when even discussing technical matters. Many meetings that the Secretary General wanted to have had to be cancelled, etc. Now, everything changed, funnily enough, I must say, when the so-called Arab Spring came. Suddenly, the international agenda deviated towards what was going on domestically in many Arab countries. Also, the importance of international terror and migration in the international agenda changed the situation drastically. Nobody seemed to be bothered by the Israeli-Arab conflict anymore, and so it was also in the Union for the Mediterranean. To illustrate the change, since 2012, I was told by Professor Ilan Het, about 1/3 of the time set aside for UFM ministerial meetings, only 1/3 is devoted to political dialogue. And the Middle East peace process is only one of the many subjects dealt with there. Contrast this, for instance, with what goes on at the Commission of Human Rights in Geneva's United Nations headquarters every year. And one can see the difference of what I'm talking about. In recent meetings, the Middle East peace process has been dealt with in 20 minutes. A small ritual to speak of, adamantly defended by the Arab side, as the European Union would have liked to leave even those 20 minutes aside for other purposes. And since 2008 and until 2015, I must note, there were no any summits as the one convened that year in Paris by Sarkozy, because it was impossible to convene, okay? Now, it seems to be the case, and I am rushing it, that since 2015, Arab countries have renounced and rectified and have decided to have the UFM as a purely project-style organization for the good of everybody else. Now I wanted to make some provisional conclusions. Is that good? Or am I? Conclusions there, yeah. With time, it appears to every observer of the scene that it is the European Commission that runs the show in the Union for the Mediterranean. Actually, the odds of future success of the Union are high because paradoxically the EU, and particularly the EU Commission, has reversed very much its initial pretty hostile position towards the project of President Sarkozy. It has realized that, in fact, the UFM needs more the Commission than the Commission needs the UFM. In other words, once it became clear that the UFM was not rivaling the European Union in any way, or did not even minimally project a shadow over the EU bilateral and even multilateral relations with Mediterranean non-member countries, the EU realized that keeping the new animal, the new creature alive, and actually providing generous funds for its running was a very rewarding operation, which costs the EU taxpayer not much at all, and apparently makes everybody happy, including Arab countries and Israel. This trend seems to be destined to be amplified, following Vicky's argument, a prominent scholar, whereby with the Arab Spring, it has become much more difficult for the EU Commission to have bilateral projects implemented in view of the difficult situation of the new elected governments in much of the Arab world. Much of the money allotted by the European Neighborhood Instrument in its 2014-2020 cycle cannot be disbursed, according to Vicky, because they cannot be easily absorbed by Arab beneficiary countries according to strict EU rules. Corruption, turmoil, strikes, call it what you want. Now, the second reason I am optimistic, or say I find a positive influence, is what I call, following Buñuel, the discrete charm of ownership. Initially described as a gimmick of President Sarkozy, for example, I have the example of Israel, which is happy to belong now to a club on a regional basis. For some Mediterranean countries, apparently getting involved and being accepted increases motivation to participate in joint ventures, even if a cost is attached to it, be it in the form of obeying some rules or whatever. It is clear that many Mediterranean countries have become, say, independent only recently, I mean, several decades ago, were formerly colonized. And they are very proud, and they don't like to be bullied nor imposed supranational rules decided elsewhere, in our case, Brussels. And they don't want to trade potential economic gains for political concessions. And the case of Morocco is very clear, okay? I think that the fact that the UFM is based on co-ownership does give the impression that even if in practice the EU Commission runs the show, it is less visible. Let's put it like this. For me, more significant than that is that Mediterranean countries are part of the founding members of the UFM. They are not latecomers joining an international organization after its creation, like, for example, Britain was in relation to the EEC then. So they are not paying the price of adjusting that to something that is pre-existing. They were there, these Mediterranean countries, at the creation of the UFM. So that gives them an impression that they cannot be taken for a ride. Okay? There are also reasons to be optimistic about the will by different actors to present projects. For the moment, there has not been a lack of projects for labeling. Out of 47 labeled projects, about 15 are implemented, but more than 100 are on the pipeline, which is a lot. Now, the downside, to finish about all what I said in an optimistic slant, is that everything is voted by consensus. For the moment, there have not been problems. However, I must say about the appetite of being active is not well spread across the organization. In other words, it is always the same countries that are proposing projects. And there are countries that are not interested at all, not presenting anything. Turkey is an important country, you would accept, you would admit with me. Country is totally absent, and Israel is practically absent, in spite of all what I said before. And then Morocco runs the show in the south. Egypt now seems more interested. And in the north, it's always the Mediterraneans that are in the forefront, and Sweden. There are exceptions. I said Britain is completely absent. Okay? Another clear downside of all what I said here is that there is a strong flavor of intergovernmentalism. And it means that there is no will at all to reform in the South, to make reforms like the Europeans would like. It's a very modest approach, but as always one says, it's better than nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tovias. Now we're going to open the Q&A session for anyone who would like to ask questions for Mr. Tovias. But first I wanted to make a short remark and sort of, sometimes it's difficult for students to really situate themselves in the grand scheme of things. The EU has carried out so many foreign policy initiatives towards neighboring countries, and Mediterranean is one of the areas that's been very, very interested in over many decades for now. And to students, the question I usually get from students is, why is it that the EU, this economic colossus on the northern rim of the Mediterranean, is not able, for so many decades after having tried, to make a bigger impact or helping these countries in a better way? And I think that Professor Tovias pointed to this in a really useful way, how difficult it is for the EU that doesn't have an executive branch as a state would have. It doesn't have a bureaucracy that implements. It doesn't have hordes of people descending on countries trying to implement projects and things like that, like other international organizations could have. They have volunteers, etc., that go there in the name of those international organizations. Now, the EU foreign policy very often relies on non-state actors, NGOs, or other types of actors that work for under their associations' names in these countries. The EU might fund them, but the EU is nowhere to be seen in these projects, even if there's a small EU label somewhere and whatnot. And also these associations, which is completely legitimate, they work according to their own agenda very often. So it's not like they're streamlined and sort of front load the EU agenda, or they explain too much what the EU goals are with all these projects. So this is the big conundrum for the EU, and it has been for so many decades now, how to implement and how to get its agenda across, how to make neighboring countries sort of engage with the EU and carry out things that would be of mutual interest. The UFM was supposed to be a little bit this executive branch in between somehow, but as we heard, for all the good reasons, it has foundered in its attempt. And now it's essentially a quite small deal in the grand scheme of things of the European neighborhood policies of different typologies. All right, so let's open the floor to all of you that might have questions. Professor Tovias is a seasoned university professor. He's so used to all types of questions, so don't hesitate to ask any question that might be uppermost in your mind. We have a microphone code. If I might impose, can you present yourself and let us know which institution you're representing?
Yes, of course. My name is Linnea, and I'm from eBay. So I follow the course of the European Union and the neighboring countries. I was just thinking, like, what is the biggest success that the Union for the Mediterranean has had? Like, what is something that they have implemented in a way that they are quite proud of or feel like it was successful?
Other questions, or shall I answer?
Maybe we need this question to break the ice a bit. Oh, okay. My name?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Manuel Herrera, also from UA. My question is related with, for example, how the Union for the Mediterranean could be a useful asset or tool for, I don't know, for example, for the European Union in order to manage to solve the current crisis that takes place in the Mediterranean basin, or whether the EU or another actors, whoever they be, can use this kind of platforms in order to, I don't know, for example, tackle the issue of in Libya, or yes, mainly I'm thinking about the migration crisis, whether this platform could be a useful tool in order to deal with these kind of issues. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Anna from eBay too, and I want to relate to the other question on migration, asking if the Union for Mediterranean could benefit from the presence of Libya as more than an observer, but as a member, and what if Libya has tried to be a member, like obtain membership, and what have been the obstacles for that, and generally, what is the status between the relationship between the Union and Libya, in a sense?
Well, maybe I start. Well, to begin with, I will start from the end. As far as I know, Libya is not a member of the Union for the Mediterranean. Maybe it's an observer, but it's not very active. So that is my... Huh?
It's not an observer.
Not an observer anymore. Okay, so it's not there. So that makes things a little difficult, of course. Concerning migration and refugees, the matter is being studied by the UFM, so it's not that it is absent. At least it is recognized as being a matter within the realm of interest of the UFM. So that there are a lot of ideas being floated around. I want to make a general remark. I mean, I think that the problems of the Mediterranean right now are overwhelming. I mean, we are speaking about an increasing complication, not decreasing complication, with what is going on in the Mediterranean. The situation was very bad already, I must say, in the times I was a student like you, because I was warning always that there is an explosion brewing, and if Europe does not launch a Marshall Plan, massive plan of aid to countries in North Africa, this is going to explode them in their face. Now, they decided that they don't have the money for that, and that they don't want it, and that it's enough if you develop trade with these countries. They will be